recorded to the cloud. Okay, and we are up and running. It's a beautiful Tuesday morning here in the Midwest, and autumn is in the air. The pumpkins are starting to get plump, and I am about to engage Mr. Adam C. Hall on a discussion about A Course in Miracles and how the Course came to him. How are you this morning, Adam?
I'm well, Chris. It's nice to be here with you. Greetings, salutations.
Well, now, you have a very interesting life because you were very successful and, had a family and had, I guess you could say, kind of the sweet life, the American dream going on before you even came into A Course in Miracles. So give us a little background on how you discovered the Course, and then we'll look at other things that entail the impact it's had on your life.
Well, I discovered the Course in the midst of a breakdown. I was entering into the proverbial dark night of the soul, the journey beyond the life experience that I was having in ostensibly as a professional businessman, earth conqueror, living the American dream and all the accoutrements that came with that. Yet I knew something was missing, and I opened myself up to receiving a deeper message from the divine and from those messengers that have come to all of us, Chris, over the millennia to bring this greater gift of God into our lives and to support our journey. So I discovered the Course in Miracles early on in that process, which was 13 years ago, and it forever impacted, changed, and evolved my entire life existence, ultimately to allow me to move beyond my sense of separate identity and to step fully into the Christ mind. And the Course has been instrumental in supporting that process.
Mm-hmm.
So I was initially introduced to the Course because I picked up Gary Renard's book, A Disappearance of the Universe. And of course, one thing led to another. And I've been a very avid student of the Course for the last 13 years, having read the Course 3 times, as well as done the workbook 3 times. I'm currently, doing the workbook every day, but essentially as a continuing deeper practice of my own healing journey and the expression of divine in my life.
Very good. Well, now, I know with the Course, once you start to get into it, it's not unusual to, start to move in that direction and then all of a sudden have a crisis occur, after you're into it for a month or a year or 2 or 3 years. It seems like you arrive at a point where the ego puts up a lot of resistance and says, I don't want this anymore. Did you find that that was a part of your journey as well?
Absolutely. And it's a continuing evolution of the journey in and of itself, Chris. And so I'm consistently confronted in the life school of challenges that are essentially engaging the old design, as I referred to it, the ego design, the idea of separate identity and living in the world of judgment of one another. And so I am in deep practice and humbled by the teachings of the Course every day. So, and yes, there is an evolutionary process to the Course. And as I have moved through it over the years, working deeper and deeper within its teachings, discovering something new, palpable, and resonant each and every time I pick up the course. So it's an evolutionary process that I found, which makes it so real and live and palpable in my life. And ultimately, to address your question, I went through a series of breakdowns and breakthroughs. But ultimately, one thing that I can share with you and those other students of the course who are moving through this greater process themselves on this journey home to the place we never left, is that it is a process that ultimately has evolved into breakdown is no longer necessary, and that there is simply breakthrough and the dissolution of the old structure, which I refer to as Adam 1.0, which is also applicable to human 1.0, because now we're emerging into the 2.0 nature of humanity. What I'm observing is that the learning process actually comes to an end, and a very enlightened expression of God in the world now shines through all of us and in each of us. So it's an evolution. It's a
Right.
journey.
Absolutely. And it's a very personal one too. You know, it seems like we, all of us, are looking for a group experience, and there is that to a certain degree with the course. But the thing that I find very attractive is that I feel like it is an intimate relationship that I'm having with the divine that had always been there, but I was never aware of it until the course came into my life and I actually was able to observe it. So is that another part of the journey that you find very appealing, the fact that it does have that intimate nature?
It does, and initially that can actually feel a bit disturbing. And as a man, I have been evolving into the greater vulnerability and intimacy of my own sensibility of what it really means to be a man, and the intimacy associated with communing with the divine, communing with God, allowing our brother Jesus to guide our journey as we walk together, side by side, knowing that we have each other's back and knowing that the light is what we follow. And so over this own personal evolution, as you're expressing in your life, and it sounds like this is something that you have found as well, is that the communion becomes very sacred, and certainly an expression of God's grace in the world. And it's as the defensive nature of my operating system in the old separate design of ego, that as that waned, as the dissolution of that unfolded, thankfully in due part to all the work with the course that I've done and other traditions, primarily indigenous traditions, we do share a very similar intersection of our indigenous traditions in the course. But thankfully, as I moved deeper into the work, I relished the peace of God as it emerged from within, and I relished the intimacy, and it's helped me as a man to be in the world, in my expression, sharing that greater vulnerability and that greater love and that intimacy of the oneness of who we are as God's expression in the world. So
right.
Yes, indeed, brother. Thank you for bringing that up.
Right. Well, and then, you were doing your successful businessman thing there in Southern California, the Santa Barbara region, and having, just kind of the typical American experience in some ways, especially for people who are kind of on that upward curve. So when you started to enter into this study and, later the actual practice of the Course in Miracles, what happened with your wife and your daughters? Because I'm sure that they definitely saw something that was going on.
Well, I shared that in the book that I wrote a couple years ago, The Earth Keeper, and ultimately the process of moving through the challenges of my ego design was one of surrender. And the Course works deeply with the idea of surrender, idea of death and rebirth, and ultimately into a greater emergence of our divine nature. And yes, my children and my family, and well as every other aspect of my life, has evolved, dissolved, and emerged into its greater unfolding. And perhaps no greater challenge that I faced was with the movement of that into that divine as it relates to my children. And ultimately the challenge that my journey posed to my wife, who reacted in a very, defensive manner and very reactionary way for understandable reasons, yet it was a great impact on the life of the family. But ultimately, to emerge in the greater love of what the divine is expressing through my life and in the place that I am one with my children. So the children actually, and the evolution of the experience and the surrender, actually served as a super powerful teaching in the life school, in that it asked that I invoke a greater power, so to speak, of God's grace, of the light mind of Christ, to move into that place where I could meet the children, not in their story or not in my story, but simply in our collective story. And that's a process that continues to unfold, but yet it's a process that I hold, as painful and difficult as it has been, but I hold in a place of surrender to the divine design, to allow that to fully emerge as truth and as love in my lives and their lives. Mm-hmm. So indeed, we move through very difficult things, and whether that's the death of a loved one, as well as the death and surrender of the lives as we know it. But ultimately, Chris, I think you may find this as well. It's not that it's a shedding of everything you knew. It's really a release and an evolution of what we know as our life journey. And the Course has been guided me deeply in this way, and certainly Brother Jesus has done that as well, and helped me certainly through these very difficult and challenging times. But ultimately, the evolutionary thrust has been very potent, and it's really moving through me and this body temple very fluidly, and which gives a sense of great joy and love of life in one another.
That's wonderful, yes. And I think that truly is what, the Course has as its underlying purpose, is to heal all relationships. And I find it funny that Gary Renard, comes out with his book and does his teaching thing. And one of the earliest things that happened was that with his life, he moved on from the wife that he had and ended up getting remarried to Cindy. And Cindy is, much more of a pilgrim in the same direction that Gary is. So it can have the effect of completely, disassociating you from some people and bringing new people in who are a little bit more on point to all the aims and goals and desires that the course will have for you. And that's, again, a big part of that is, learning how to just let go and not try to make a plan of your own, to let the course make the plan for you.
Well, yes, and you're right on point with that, because ultimately, as a ex-narcissist, a control freak, obsessive survival thinking mind, which many of these things dominate our current human condition, I concur with you that it really necessitates a greater alignment with that place of our sacred center. And that in turn synchronizes our lives with a greater flow of the divine, as you are no doubt experience yourself, which creates synchronicity, which creates synergy, which creates collaboration and cooperation and co-creation with one another. And it's a beautiful thing, and it's brought tremendous joy into my life, a deep sense of the peace of God and that of the love of God through a indwelling of expression of forgiveness in all my moments. And I wrote something in the first part of my book, The Earthkeeper, and I would like to share it with you all at the moment, just to express what you brought up, Chris, if that's okay.
Oh, that's awesome. Yes.
Yes, and this is from the Course. I am responsible for what I see. I choose the feelings I experience, and I decide upon the goal I would achieve. And everything that seems to happen to me, I ask for and receive as I have asked. I have done this thing, and it is that I shall undo. Amen.
Yes, absolutely, yes. That's the actual fact of it is, the way we script the experiences we have in the material world, it is always designed to make us the hero of our dream, and at the same time, a victim who is always suffering at the hands of mortality and materiality and all of those different things. And so once you start to step into the Course, the whole role of being a victim, that line from the Course, I am not a victim of the world I see, becomes more and more salient. So did you really have a big list after you got into the Course of all these different ways that you were buying into that victim role?
Well, it certainly was a process of recapitulation of my life's journey. And I also engage in many different modalities that have served the Earth School over the millennium, and in particular, the indigenous traditions and shamanic teachings. And so in the weaving of the Course and my shamanic training and traditions, it ultimately led to this greater experience of recapitulation of the victim perpetrator role in a clear observance, because as the Course asked us to do is simply to sit in the audience of the movie of our lives and to become an observer of this greater orchestration of which was created ostensibly as our separate self, because ultimately the atonement principle that's the Course applies is that there is no such thing as a separate self. It's a bit silly in its own right, but ultimately we speak in duality in the earth school. We must address it where we are, and we are operating or have chosen to operate in that separate design, which is geared towards this victim perpetrator mentality. And that's a very well crafted ego design that is consistently expounding a sense of separation, which the Course refers to as sin, often misunderstood as you're doing something wrong, but no, it's simply separation from source, or perceived separation of source, because it's not possible to be separate from source. So it's simply a thought of separation. It speaks directly to the guilt associated that emerges with that thought and the extension of that thought into our separate identity of separate self and in the body, and the guilt that we feel ultimately from making that choice to be separate from our God nature, the essence and the quintessence of who we all are. And ultimately the guilt becomes a nature of our projection of our mind. So often we're subjugating that sense of emotion and deeper feeling of guilt onto others. And so what I recognize is I created an entire operating system to defend against God, to actually orchestrate my life in association with things that were always keeping the separate self in its ostensive existence and reality when it has really no reality. And then thirdly and lastly, I would add, in addition to the idea of the sin and the separation and the guilt, is really that greater fear. That fear of the peace of God, and that fear that there's a greater wrath of God that has been projected primarily socially and culturally and imprinted by many theologies and religions over the millennium as well. So the engagement of victim perpetrator mentality and the observance of sitting within the audience of your life and just sitting there with the presence of Jesus, observing this greater play of separation, allows us and allowed me to bear witness to my sense of victim perpetrator mentality. And I often refer to it as the predator, the prey mentality as well, that is so defined our system and our domain as we operate today. Fortunately, that is now in its greater, everything is up right now, as you probably are finding yourself. There's this greater emergence, I believe, of the climate change within our inner landscape. We want to speak a lot about our climate change in our outer landscape. Yes, it's very real, but the climate change in our inner landscape is very palpable. It's unconscious, and it can be very disturbing in its own way without the proper tools. The Course allows us to gain those tools and that wisdom, because ultimately the outside picture is a reflection of our inward condition. It's very important that we acknowledge that the outward condition is a reflection of our inward condition. So when we see the world in a manner that whatever you see the world is, it is actually an unfoldment of what is happening within our own inner landscape. And the beauty of the Course is that it gives us the map and the pathway to return back from the ego to move into the greater essence of our true divine design, as I refer to it as. And because ultimately the Course teaches us that, as you well know, Chris, that the ideas do not leave their source. And when our ideas emerge from the separate self, they always come back and we are reflecting the idea of our separate self in the world. Well, ultimately, the Course really just asked us to do one thing: not to discard our life, not to not drink, not to not do any of these. It's nothing about that. It's not how to find really love or peace. It really asks us to simply take a look again, sit in that audience with Brother Jesus, who will help to guide us. And there are many great guides. And certainly Brother Jesus is not the only one. But ultimately to look again and to look at this system that has been designed to separation, and to come to see it for really what it is, and to choose again. Because we have this choice far beyond this victim-perpetrator mindset. We have this place where we can return to this presence of the divine within our lives and say, I no longer choose the thought of separation. I no longer choose death. I choose life. I choose to live in the eternal immortality of my divine nature, as one with all brothers and sisters, as one with earth as well. So very important entry point to experience what has emerged in our lives, and to look at that. And it's what I have spent many, many years and thousands of hours doing, documenting, and being in the presence of the divine and those that serve the divine. And thankful to be to all of, and the grace of God, that there are many like you, and many, many that are on earth now that are here to really share this greater expression, not as some utopia or new age thought, but really as a shift of mind to whole mind, to divine mind, to God mind, to Christ's reflection in the world. And we're coming together not in separation and not in the I am or I art thou, but we, thou. We are the divine.
Yes, there is absolutely nothing that is apart from this I amness. It's a seamless union. And I think that was something I first was attracted to the Course with, was the idea of non-duality. Because when I was in my 20s, I discovered Paramahansa Yogananda and went to the center there in Southern California on a couple of occasions. And I really felt like there was a spark there, but I didn't know where to go from that place. Yogananda gave me a lot of imagery and ideas, but he didn't catapult me up to that next level. You know, and then I started doing Mary Baker Eddy's stuff with Science and Health, and that was another evolutionary step. So it is a natural progression, and you'll find that if you simply ask the question, God, you know, teach me, let me understand what you are and how you exist and how I am in relationship to you, then the answers come flooding in. It's just astonishing how fast you find all of the answers popping up in your life. So back 13 years ago, when you first started off with A Course in Miracles, were you magnetized to different individuals? Because, you know, back then we didn't have this resource of the internet like we have now. So it was kind of difficult to find community. But I would think in Southern California there, you had probably a lot of people who showed up on your radar screen as people who were furthering the teachings of the course. Did you like join a group or attend workshops or anything of that nature, or was it primarily solo for, you know, a long period of time?
Well, it was primarily solo, ultimately because part of the journey, at least on the onset, it necessitated a degree of solidarity, which was really engaged me deeply in a course teaching of unlearning. And I very much have adopted this as a powerful formula that actually creates tremendous velocity to the process of becoming self-aware, to returning ultimately and remembering that we are all enlightened beings and children of God. And the work that I initiated was one that I was asked by my guides, present and not present on earth, yet always present as angels or ascended masters or whatever that may be for you, to work deeply into this process of unlearning. And this is a little bit befuddling to, I think, many course students that oftentimes grapple with the challenge of the course, because the course is a challenging process in many, many ways, but it's only challenging because of how we exercise our engagement with it, meaning we engage intensely in a left brain process. What's practical, what's rational, how do we want to understand that from our linear world? And how do we move from A to B to C? And what I found, and one of the gifts that I received deeply from the course is, and also in addition to what has emerged from me through ascended masters and the shamanic teachings, the indigenous teachings, is to work with really one of the great gifts of the course, which is the sense of the mystical, mythic nature of the course as it expresses symbols. So I spent immense time working with the symbols and the archetypes that are often not seen, at least through the first reading and through the first work around the workbook, that can really be engaged on a deeper place of the mythic nature. Because ultimately, when I was able to move beyond the rational linear process with the course and move into the mythic, symbolic, archetypical nature, the teaching of unlearning, and it's very alchemical in nature, because ultimately we are unwinding a design. And in that unwinding of that design, we are experiencing a process we're not familiar with, which is that unlearning, which is in its own right a surrendering. So the work that I was asked to do on behalf of the guides was simply engage on a deeper level of your own sense of solidarity, so that you are truly in this intimate communion and to be in that place. And I ask you, Chris, has that been your experience, or have you too really been engaging with a lot of great workshops? Because there's so many great teachers of the course out there, no doubt about them. And I'm always curious about them. I mean, it's interesting to see what Gary has done Bernard has done with him, and where Marianne Williamson, who's one of the more well-known, is gone with that work, and also other emergence of guides, course teachers like Gabby Bernstein and some others. And I know that the course applies to all my work today. Everything I'm doing within the framework of my life is within the framework that emerged from the greater traditions, not only the shamanic traditions, but the course traditions. And so I don't advocate necessarily the solidarity or the intensity of engagement in the course as a learning process. We got to feel into what works for you. And I'm curious, what has worked for you as a student of the course yourself?
Well, it's kind of, pardon me, it's kind of interesting in that I started out with the course about 20 years ago. And in the journey, it has been about 80% of that time I was pretty much on my own, very much like you. It was an inward journey. But about 3.5, 4 years ago, I started to be driven in the direction of reaching out and connecting with people and networking and developing a dialogue like this series that I'm doing on YouTube here about how people have discovered the course. And I have, a half a dozen other threads that are going on my YouTube channel where I'm talking about the course with friends and with people I've encountered along the journey. But I think that there is a reference in the course in a couple of different places that talks about the idea of our ministry. And I think that, that definitely has shown up for me in the last 4 years. I feel like I have been launched into that space. And so now I'm very excited because I feel like there are a lot of opportunities coming up to interact with a larger and larger circle of people. And just recently started doing an introduction to A Course in Miracles on Wednesday evenings on Humanity Healing Network. And my first couple of episodes of that, I've had about 5,000 people globally that showed up for it. So I think all of us do have a ministry. And when we are finally at that tipping point where we're ready to commit to it, all of a sudden you find yourself in the undertow of where the ship is headed. It's like the ship of Course in Miracles is out in high seas, and you're in the undertow of that, riding along with a bunch of dolphins, and you find yourself being thrust into situations where you can participate in that teaching process, and that amps up your learning process. In order to learn, you have to teach. That's one of the more beautiful aspects of it. And that's become very visceral for me. I have accelerated my growth immensely as a result of stepping into the role of teaching.
Wonderful, wonderful. And yes, in order to learn, we must teach. And I honor you for the expansion of your ministry, Chris. This is wonderful work, and I think you bring up a very important point for all of us, and that is that in the establishment of our ministry, that it is incumbent upon us in our own unique way to express these teachings that are certainly supporting all our brothers and sisters in their own evolutionary process. And during these times of great change, everyone is needed. These ministries are being called forth, and I too engage my work now as a greater ministry. And it's very palpable. And this morning, before I came to be with you all, I pulled from my altar a Bible that in many ways is a little bit disassembled, but it was the Bible of my grandfather. And he was a minister of God in the early 1900s. He was an Episcopalian minister, but essentialist. He was one of the original revivalist ministers, and he traveled around the country by train, sharing his ministry. And I pulled that down to invoke his greater journey in honor of his work and his ministry, to bring that forth for all of us today, to have this as a greater expression. And let's bear in mind that a ministry, I think important that we don't narrowly define what that ministry looks like or feels like in our lives. I mean, in everything we do, we have an experience of our ministry, which is simply an expansive nature, an infinite nature and expansion of God's grace in the world and the peace of God that lives within all of us. And we can bring that to everything we do, whether we're going to the market, whether we're creating something at our work, whatever it is we do to feel into this ministry. And, you know, it's very, very, very palpable that we really build upon what you're saying and the importance of that as we all create a ministry and express these teachings and learn them deeply ourselves. And it's a powerful place and a wonderful joy. And it seems that you're experiencing that now as well as you expand your ministry.
Exactly, absolutely. Well, now, we've had our first contact, the first communication I had with you was about 7 or 8 years ago. And you showed up on my radar screen, and I was really smitten with a project that you were engaged in called the Earthkeeper Alliance. And so, you know, we were unaware of the fact that both of us at that time were engaged in A Course in Miracles at the same time. But I find it kind of humorous how a lot of times our associations with people, our attraction to people, our interest in other people really is a reflection of the range of consciousness that we're currently engaged in. And so, you know, there was this like-mindedness that I intuitively connected with you, associated with you. But you've got some amazing stuff going on with some of your real estate activities and trying to honor the earth, honor the foundation that we are building on here in this realm of space and time. So why don't you give people a little insight as to what the Earthkeeper Alliance is?
Well, I will, and I'd like to speak of that in the context of the ministry and the greater expression of the work, so to speak. And I really refer to it as the joy, because I think of this work as joy. And ultimately, the evolution of the Earthkeeper Alliance is is being propelled by a very powerful trajectory of Earth changes. And a lot of folks would think of that simply as climate change, which is appropriate. And as I chose to evolve my Earth conquering nature to disassemble and reassemble and redesign and re-architecture my own personal divine design to emerge into the greater light of who I am and what I'm here to do, the evolution of the Earthkeeper Alliance has been very powerful because I'm no longer physically involved in day-to-day operations of doing real estate work itself. The Earthkeeper Alliance began as a for-profit entity that was doing work primarily around greater conservation of land and redesigning and re-architecting what communities can look like. And there's just great work unfolding. We had wonderful projects that emerged and things that were accomplished there. And then ultimately I recognized that what was coming to me through community was this greater work to really focus also intently, not simply on conservation, preservation, and restoration of Earth as physical Earth in our outer landscape, but conservation, preservation, and restoration of our Earth as beings and our expression in form. And that ultimately speaks directly to a powerful course teaching, which simply says, don't try to change the world. Simply change your mind about the world. In other words, let's move into not simply trying to change our outer landscape and all those things associated and people associated with our outer landscape, but to engage in our inner landscape to actually create a greater expression of whole mind. So the idea of that really is simply, as it relates to the Earthkeeper Alliance, the expansion of that alliance around the globe is really a greater web and connecting point for people that are focused intently not only on conservation of Earth and preservation of Earth and restoration. Mother Earth will be fine, but ultimately it's humanity itself, the essence of our being that's itself that must be examined and more fully expressed in its divine nature. And I recognize this because of the inequity and imbalance within the human population, the human imprint, in conjunction with what is really organically needs to unfold. So my work as it relates to the Earthkeeper Alliance is a continuation of conservation and preservation and restoration of Earth, not for commercial purposes, but ultimately to emerge into a greater expression of what we're doing as people, as Earth keepers, as people that are tending to not simply our Earth Mother, but also the Earth within ourselves. And this is the greater imperative in my feeling, that to meet the challenges, and potentially some of them are as extreme as extinction, this mass sixth great extinction on Earth, to really engaging to a new story. And so I have been really sharing this new story. And what does that new story look like as we create and craft and express the new story together, because it is within the we. The Christ that is emerging on the planet at this time is not an individual, as we heard from Thich Nhat Hanh. It's really a sense of the Christ mind that we share. We art thou. We are the divine, and that the age of those that are simply have helped us to get us there, the guru or the priest or what may not, while relevant, really is really now unfolded and evolved into this greater we presence of the divine. So I'm holding that space, activating that space. I believe it's a powerful activation. It's less of a traditional learning process. So the Earthkeeper Alliance is all about bringing that inspired message of our divine nature into action, a place where it's actionable. How do we apply that now? How do we apply that in our relationships and in all of the things that we're doing to uplift this humanity that we're being called to do in each of our ministries? So the evolution is very palatable, and I enjoy riding the edge of my own evolution, but also the edge of humanity's evolution to hold this place of oneness and divinity in its its proper perspective to share with all my brothers and sisters. So that's what's up with the Earthkeeper Alliance and what's up with Adam in particular.
That's pretty awesome. And yeah, I was enchanted with your activity along the California coast there, because I'm a lover of the Big Sur region. And that region, you know, is an area where you were having an impact. And I know you've also got projects going on over in Hawaii now, which is very cool. But ultimately, you know, as I've observed on social media, everybody's running around responding to a specific disaster. Oh, we need to pray for the hurricane victims or the wildfire victims or this victim or that victim. And again, that gives us a sense of separation that reinforces the idea that there is specialness. These guys got banged up and they're special and we need to rescue them. And I think that is a distraction, really, in a lot of ways that we need to address, because we need to be constantly in a state of prayer and affirmation about the wholeness and the divinity and the perfection of every being that appears to be on the planet. So I think a lot of times all these crises are kind of a pushback from our own ego, saying, you know, these people have it really bad and we need to reach out to them. Obviously, we do need to reach out to them, but we have to move beyond the idea of specialness. Do you agree with that?
Well, it's indeed, and I think the idea of specialness and the idea of idolization, it exercises the muscle of the ego design to continue to perpetuate a victim perpetrator mentality, a separate mentality. And that's not to dismiss in the physical world the pain and suffering that is occurring. And certainly I feel a deep sense of compassion for what is emerging in many people's lives and what is happening for all of our brothers, sisters, be them experiencing hurricanes or earthquakes or effects of the solar flare or other chaos that exist on the planet. Ultimately, we know that there's a greater purification that emerges through these very powerful forces that are being magnetized and amplified due to the collective mindset of separation of humanity. So that speaks directly to why the ministry here is focusing in its expansion on the inner landscapes too, so that we have the tools via the course and whatnot to address some of these things. But the essence of specialness is something that is really goes to the root of, you know, why the course. And it really speaks directly to the idea of being thrown out of the garden, which is a ludicrous idea, because we ultimately were never thrown out of the garden, and God's love would never say anything of the sorts that you took a bite of an apple and I'm going to throw you out of the garden. And God sees us as one, as whole, and doesn't sense, well, I feel that you, Joe, or you, Mary, or you are any more special than anybody else. And in that process of the atonement principle that this course speaks about, that we have never left the garden, and that there is only the oneness and presence of God in our life, to recognize that our incessant need to be seen. And I know I experienced this. For much of my 56 years, wanting to be seen, wanting to be heard, wanting this deep sense of belonging. It's a bottomless pit of desires and needs that the separate design and ego design invokes. And it literally is was a life of death. I was being born to die. It was identifying myself as manifest form in body, which dies, of course, but really missing the greater totality of our human experience that separate the idea of specialness and ideal of idolizations, whether it's idolization of something of food or money or just incessant needs to belong or to be seen, or the idea of invoking special relationships, even a complete misunderstanding of what love and forgiveness are in the world. So this is a very important aspect of the Course, Chris, that you mentioned, this incessant need for specialness. And it's not to dehumanize our compassion for one another. It's only to say that the invocation of prayer for others is actually a counterintuitive, has a counterintuitive effect. It's almost paradoxical in nature because it's actually invoking that there's something special or wrong with another versus really holding the greater capacity and meeting those that are ostensibly in need in the place of our oneness, in the place of light. So, for example, in the journey over the last week with earth changes and earth events, in engaging the Course was simply about engaging in prayer and affirmation of the light and the place within each of us, and to invoke that within those that have been impacted by these events, to invoke that place versus all the prayers, something's wrong, something's terrible, so you need this, to really hold that sacred center. So your point is a very good one, and it's often misunderstood about how we engage this idea of specialness and idols and prayer and affirmation. So good on you to bring that up and hold that, although it's easily misunderstood, if you know what I'm saying.
Oh yeah, there are definitely people who will throw a couple of rocks at you if you get too vocal about things like that. But that again is the nature of our work, is that, you know, we don't go out and stand on a soapbox in the middle of Times Square and scream our story. We are compelled to go deeply within, and it becomes again a very personal process. And you know, it's like that old story in the Bible about going into the closet to pray. And that really is, I think, a big part of what we, of Course in Miracles people do, is we have our sacred space and we retire to it, and that's where the real work gets accomplished.
Indeed, those are the deeper waters that ostensibly are the unknown. And of course, the Course speaks beautifully to that, because it's not the unknown itself we fear. We simply fear the idea that it's unknown. We don't know what the unknown is, but the idea of entering into the sanctuary of being, which really in essence is, that I experience, is coming to the altar and kneeling at the altar of God, and being in the presence of the divine and all the palpable energies that support the light's expression in the world in real time, not as some ethereal abstraction, non-specific abstraction, but to really be living that in our life, in our own inner sanctum, and honoring that place, because in those deeper indwelling of those waters, what I have found, Chris, is that indwelling is ultimately emerges into an outward facing expression of God's light and grace in the world. And sensing that, you know, we often, I did a short piece on this. I the other day. I haven't published it yet, but I did a short piece on leaning out versus leaning in. And as we know, we've heard so much through that book that Sheryl Sandberg published a few years back about leaning into your expression, into your life. But ultimately, the question that was not addressed in that is where are you leaning in from? And the manuscript focuses, well, you lean in with your head and your sense of power, belonging, of showing your truth, and putting it forth. That's palpable, important. But what really is important as well, where are you leaning in from? So when in the presence of the divine that is expressed in through our heart and the soul, the deeper soul nature of that expression within ourselves, we lean out from there. We lean out into the world. So it took this being lifetimes to stop leaning in to its obsession with these things like, who am I? What do I need to do? Why am I not special? How can I be seen? What do I need to belong? You know, all this obsessive nature that was in this design, to really say, okay, I've come to a place of unlearning, a disassociation, transcending, transforming, including those aspects that belong, but ultimately to lean out into our ministry, into one another, so that we can share that with each other.
Yeah. And that's a good way, or a good high point here to sum up our communication for today, although I feel like we will have more dialogue in the future. This has been an absolute pleasure having this chance to have a chat with you. How can people find you? How can they track you down in cyberspace and in the three-dimensional world?
Well, it's in the three-dimensional realm. You can find me through my email, which is simply ahall@earthkeeperalliance.com. ahall@earthkeeperalliance.com. You can find me on Instagram, Adam Charles Hall on Instagram, or you can certainly find me on Facebook, Adam Hall. And so you can find these greater transmissions and elucidations that I'm expressing in real time and in this incarnation as an expression of divine's light in the world, in communion with each of you. So please feel free to check me out in any of those places. Send me a note if you choose. And ultimately, you can find me also in the deeper communing space of the love that we share with one another. And I spoke to this the other day. I made a short piece. All my pieces are very short, regarding gratitude. And that's quite simply, I was communing in the purity of and the grandeur and the cathedral of Mother Nature at about 8,500 feet up in the Sawtooth mountain range in Idaho. And I was overwhelmed with this sense of gratitude. And of course, I began a process of deep gratitude for my children and blessing them and my family and my friends and my lover and my community, and to be in this greater presence and form, and how deeply I feel. And I asked further, what is this source of this gratitude, Chris? And the answer was very, very clearly, I heard the words, namaste. I celebrate the place in you where we are one. In the Makesh, in the Mayan tradition, I am another one of you. So you can find me in the fourth dimensional reality and beyond, in the place that we are one, in the Christ mind, the presence of God's love and grace in the world.
Yes, absolutely. And yes, the Mayans were very, very alert to that identity thing. You know, that was 700 years ago. They were running through the forest and they would bump into each other and they would say, I am another yourself. And I've always been very enchanted with that concept. So anyway, Adam, it was great chatting with you. And I'll also mention that Adam's website is Earthkeeper Alliance. So just type that into your browser and you will be able to see all of the different amazing things he's engaged in. So you have a fantastic rest of the day there in sunny California. And I'll talk to you at some point soon.
I look forward to it, Chris, and blessings to you and salutations to all of your community, and look forward to sharing more. And please feel free to reach out anytime. Be well.
Great.
Blessings.
Thank you so much.